What happened is, because of people that might know a case named Melendez-Diaz, which is some litigation that came out of Massachusetts courts, went up to the United States Supreme Court. Because of that case and because of some other things, there was a strain, and because of the war on drugs, I'll also say, there was a strain put on these forensic drug testing labs. So there was actually some consolidation that was happening. The state police were going to be, labs were moving around, I'll say, and sort of consolidating. When that happened, some things, some behaviors, some practices that were not particularly appropriate, obviously, started to come into light where no one had really taken much notice of them before.
It's not unique to have forensic fraud, but I would say that of the problems that I've, encountered in my research, I would say forensic fraud is by far the least common of the big problems that I believe plague police crime labs. But it does happen and has happened in other places as well. Is it a result of the war on drugs? I would say not really. Personally, I don't think that that's really the cause of it. This happened to be in a drug lab, but we've seen forensic fraud in other disciplines within forensic labs. It could be in serology, DNA, whatever, different areas. So it's certainly not unique to drug labs.
Welcome to the award-winning podcast, Lawyer to Lawyer, with J. Craig Williams and Robert Ambrogi, bringing you the latest legal news and observations with the leading experts in the legal profession. You're listening to Legal Talk Network.
Welcome to Lawyer on the Legal Talk Network. This is Bob Ambrogi coming to you from Massachusetts, where I write a blog called Law Sites. I also co-host another Legal Talk Network program called Law Technology Now with Monica Bay.
And I'm Craig Williams coming to you from Southern California. I write a blog called May It Please the Court.
Before we get to today's topic, let me just take a moment to thank our sponsors, Clio and Litera. Clio's cloud-based practice management software makes it easy to manage your law firm from intake to invoice. Try it for free at Clio.com. That's CLIO.com. And Litera is the authority on document creation, collaboration, and control. Increase your productivity, collaborate securely, and ensure protection of your vital information. Learn all about it at www.litera.com. Well, on April 18th, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts dismissed more than 21,000 drug cases connected to the drug lab scandal that involved Annie Dookhan, a former chemist of a crime lab in Massachusetts who admitted to falsifying evidence. By many accounts, there's never been such a large-scale dismissal of cases in a single swoop in the history of the United States.
And Bob, after an investigation into Annie Dookhan and her work at the Hinton State Laboratory Institute, she admitted to altering and faking tests in order to cover up her frequent dry labbing or visually identifying samples without actually testing them over her 8+ years career. The cases involved defendants from 8 different counties in Massachusetts, and in many instances, people had been already sent to jail and some even deported.
So while the scope of this drug lab scandal is perhaps unprecedented, it's certainly not the first such scandal in our country. There have been other drug lab scandals, including in Houston, St. Paul, Oklahoma City, and San Francisco, among other places. Today on Lawyer to Lawyer, we're going to take a look at what happened here in Massachusetts and its impact on drug cases, attorneys, defendants, and talk more about what goes on inside a crime lab. To help us do that today, we have 2 guests. First of all, let me welcome to the program Carl Williams. Carl is staff attorney for the ACLU of Massachusetts. He was previously a criminal defense attorney with Roxbury Defenders Unit of the Committee for Public Counsel Services. Carl and his colleagues at the ACLU of Massachusetts represented the petitioners, thousands of people in these cases affected by the drug lab scandal, and it was their work that brought about this, the results that we're going to be talking about today. So welcome to Lawyer to Lawyer, Carl Williams.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Bob, we want to note here that we have reached out to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts as well as the Cape and Island District Attorney's Office, but both were unavailable as of our show time. We hope to have them on a future show. But in the meantime, our next guest is Sandra Guerra Thompson. She is the director of the Criminal Justice Institute at the University of Houston Law Center. Since joining the faculty in 1990, she's taught and written in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, wrongful convictions, and evidence. And back in 2015, Sandra wrote a book entitled Cops in Lab Coats, Curbing Wrongful Convictions with Independent Forensic Laboratories. Well, welcome to the show, Sandra.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Carl, we could probably spend the entire show talking about the Annie Dookhan case and the series of events that led up to the latest developments in this case. It's almost worthy of a John Grisham novel in some ways. But I wonder if you could, for our listeners who aren't familiar with what happened here and how we got to this point, if you could give us kind of the nutshell version of what happened with Dookhan.
So what happened is in 2003, a forensic chemist that worked at a laboratory testing alleged drug samples in criminal cases began doing 4 different things. One, what is called dry labbing, that is just looking at a sample that is believed to be drugs and making a guess at what it was. When she was actually supposed to be doing a chemical test on that, it's called a GCMS test. So she was dry labbing. She was also sometimes adding weight to samples. So when a sample was maybe 98 grams and if it were over 100 grams, prosecution would be, there would be a much more serious sentencing regime. She would add weight to samples. She also tainted samples. That is, at one point she put cocaine in a heroin sample, so it would test positive for heroin. And she also lied about her credentials, and she also perjured herself on the stand in relation to these cases, saying, yes, I did test that. Yes, it was 100 grams of cocaine, somewhat based on those other 3 things I mentioned. So she was doing those things over 8 years, from 2003 to 2011. That affected tens of thousands of cases. 5 years ago, the ACLU of Massachusetts demanded that all of the relevant county prosecutors dismiss these cases because due process wasn't afforded to these people. People were not aware of the fact that this behavior was going on in their cases. The relevant district attorneys chose not to do that. 2 years after that, about 3 years ago now, we filed a petition to our Supreme Judicial Court representing 3 clients who were affected by this drug lab scandal and asked the same thing, said that these cases should be dismissed. It took us basically 2 series of litigations to finally get to a point where the SJC, our Supreme Judicial Court, told DAs that they needed to come up with a very substantial list from these folks to dismiss a very substantial amount of them and then to decide what of those cases they believed that they could re-prosecute. And that's what happened just this week. DAs came up with a list of almost 22,000 cases to be dismissed and 319 cases that they choose to re-prosecute. So that's where we are today, and that's what we believe that to be the largest dismissal of criminal cases based on one court filing in the history of the United States. We might be wrong about that, but from what we understand, it's the largest.
And just to follow up on that, can I just ask how it came to light, what Dookhan had been doing?
Right. So it didn't for quite a while, like I said, the 8 years. But what happened is because of people that might know a case named Melendez-Diaz, which is some litigation that came out of Massachusetts courts, went up to the United States Supreme Court. Because of that case and because of some other things, there was a strain, and because of the war on drugs, I'll also say, there was a strain put on these forensic drug testing labs. So there was actually some consolidation that was happening. The state police were going to be, labs were moving around, I'll say, and sort of consolidating. When that happened, some things, some behaviors, some practices that were not particularly appropriate, obviously, started to come into light where no one had really taken much notice of them before. And once some of those came to light, a lot of defense attorneys started asking questions saying, hey, does that affect my case? And initially it was the district attorney said that it was limited to only one county in a very small number of cases. And then through discovery process, defense attorneys started pulling out more and more of that. And then there was ultimately a prosecution of Miss Dookhan in one of our superior courts, and she was sentenced to some prison time for her actions.
So, Sandra, is this unique to Massachusetts, or is this something that we see nationwide? And how does the war on drugs play into this?
Well, it's not unique to have forensic fraud, but I would say that of the problems that I've encountered in my research, I would say forensic fraud is by far the least common the big problems that I believe plague police crime labs. But it does happen and has happened in other places as well. Is it a result of the war on drugs? I would say not really. Personally, I don't think that that's really the cause of it. This happened to be in a drug lab, but we've seen forensic fraud in other disciplines within forensic labs. It could be in serology, DNA, whatever, different areas. So it's certainly not unique to drug labs.
What kinds of protections are there? What kind of oversight is there over these drug labs generally, Sandra? I mean, clearly in this case, the Dookhan case, there were inadequacies in oversight and what was going on. It looked like there were some red flags that were being ignored, as I understand the case. How do we know this isn't going on a much greater level?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I would say that there are a few things, right? So you have supervisors within labs, and they should be the first line of defense. There should be quality managers who are establishing standard operating procedures and making sure that those things are followed. I mean, there are lots of layers of protections that should be in place, and increasingly, we see labs becoming accredited, and the accreditation standards for those labs have been increased as well because of things like Annie Dookhan, because of, the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, and a lot of the scandals that have happened around the country, which by the way, have also been discovered via DNA exonerations in really serious cases, right? So all of these scandals have brought so much attention to the police crime labs that they've had to go back and increase standards for accreditation. So hopefully some of this stuff gets caught. But if you have a dysfunctional lab and you don't have these controls in place, which was what was going on in Massachusetts, then you're right. I mean, she might not have been the only one, and there may have been others in other labs that, have not come to light as of yet.
So, Carl, what's the remedy for this? Are we going to be seeing public defenders asking for independent labs to be established so that they can cross-check these crime labs?
So I think there's a number of types of remedies. Certainly just public defenders. I worked for the public defender system for many years in Massachusetts and defended many of these cases before we knew what was happening, and some afterwards. One thing I'll just mention is there is another drug lab scandal going on in Massachusetts where tens of thousands of cases were affected. A woman who was addicted to drugs, her name was Sonia Farrak, and that is brewing now, right? And I would, just to back up a little bit, this is a result of the war on drugs, because if we saw this type of behavior for 8 years in any other field where people were not being treated like the grist of the mill, right? People who were treated as non-human beings, people who you just lock up, mostly black people, mostly brown people, mostly almost all poor people. This never would have happened. Think of if this was a legal ethics investigator and someone came out with a fake report on me. We would sue them, they would stop, they would be fired, they may be imprisoned. If it were about anything else, this would not have happened. I actually did an interview about 5 years ago, and someone said, well, do you think this kind of thing is endemic to the war on drugs? I said, of course it is. And I said, you will see another thing like this happen in a few years, probably. Not of this size, but you'll see another thing happen. And that did happen, right? There is this Amherst drug lab scandal, and there are a number of other evidence scandals. There's a woman who was stealing drugs and guns, allegedly a police officer in Braintree, stealing drugs and guns from an evidence warehouse and doing whatever with them. Drugs, guns, money, clothing. She had clothing from the evidence warehouse at her house. So I think these things happen more when we're dealing with populations that are considered throwaway in our society, and that is black people, brown people, and poor people.
So who was it who was turning a blind eye to this situation? Was it the courts, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, everybody?
Yes, the system. Because the system looks at this. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, police investigators, jailers, to everywhere in this, they said, oh, that's another black person going into the system. Looks like a drug dealer to me. Makes sense. Don't give them the mandatory minimum, but we'll give them half of it. And when the person said, hey, what about this? Why don't we look into this? And some of these drug tests actually had come back. There are some that came back negative, right? We've seen negative certs that people were never informed of later.
So I was just going to ask Sandra, what's your impression of that? I mean, this idea that the system turns a blind eye to a lot of these cases because they just assume these people are guilty.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, absolutely. And I think, that Carl and I are not actually disagreeing on a lot of things. I would say, though, that it's not just the war on drugs, that it's a broader concern about laboratories associated with police departments, that are headed by a police chief or some, head of a law enforcement agency of some sort, who's maybe not really qualified to run a lab, and where analysts view themselves as, working for the police, to get convictions. And I would just say that it's a broader concern than just the drug crimes, because we see the same kind of bias and lack of funding within departments and lack of proper controls that allows for thefts and for frauds to go undetected. All of these things are endemic to crime labs, and they affect all kinds of cases. I mean, it so happens that we have thousands and thousands of drug cases. So when you have an Annie Dookhan, or when you have someone who's stealing drugs, which is it's a different kind of problem in a drug lab, but it also occurs, you don't have a well-managed laboratory where these things are going to be caught. And that has been a big problem with police crime labs. But I would say that it's not just in the drug cases, it's in lots of cases where we've had all kinds of exonerations in many different areas, rapes, murders, robberies, because the evidence wasn't very good. And whose fault is it? I agree, it's the system. It's not only the courts and the prosecutors, but it's the defense attorneys who also, everyone sort of gave the forensic analysts a pass and assumed that whatever results that they gave were correct. And now we're having to, take a step back and really reconsider this.
So, Carl, how does this play into the overall view and somewhat, I guess, perhaps an old saw that cops have a script when they get onto the stand and they know what to say and testify accordingly in order to get convictions?
I mean, I think so you're talking about and how that works with analysts?
No, I mean, how does the concept of just do anything to get a conviction? Do we see this throughout the system on the enforcement side?
I mean, we see this now with these cases. People, even though these, almost 22,000 cases are getting dismissed, we hear a prosecutor saying, well, these are bad guys. These are bad guys. And I'll just sort of, folks may not know, 60% of these cases, of the original 24,000 cases, 60% of those cases were people who possess drugs, simply possess drugs. And we're living in a state that believes, there's a problem with the opioid crisis. I would say there's a problem with, crises with other drugs also. But we're imprisoning, we're probationing, we're arresting people who use drugs, who just use drugs. 60% of these people were people who use drugs. And 90% of these people were people in the lower courts, our juvenile, district, and municipal courts. So these weren't the most serious cases. Only 10% of them were ever indicted. And also, put out there, a number of these cases were children, were people who were child offenders. And I think that when we look at who gets prosecuted, to pull out to the bigger picture, who gets prosecuted for crimes in Massachusetts and who commits those crimes, we know that who uses drugs and who buys and sells drugs across the United States, that is, people buy drugs from people who are like them racially, economically, and geographically, and people sell drugs to people who are like them economically, racially, and geographically. But that's not who we see arrested for these charges. And I think that goes to a very deep problem, actually agreeing with other folks said, it's to a very deep problem in our criminal justice system that is deeply focused on race, deeply.
Well, before we move on to our next segment, we're going to take a quick break to hear a message from our sponsors. Bob?
Imagine what you could do with an extra 8 hours per week. That's how much time legal professionals save with Clio, the world's leading practice management software. With intuitive time tracking, billing, and matter management, Clio streamlines everything you do to run your practice, from intake to invoice. Try Clio for free and get a 10% discount for your first 6 months when you sign up at their website, Clio.com, that's CLIO.com, with the code L2L10, that's L2L, the number 10. Documents are the currency of business. They represent you in every business interaction. Executives need to know what changes have occurred in documents, what metadata risks exist, and how to encrypt, share, and collaborate securely. Litera simplifies the document creation and collaboration process to protect you from risk and loss of reputation. Litera offers better solutions for document lifecycle management so you can focus on doing what really matters. www.litera.com.
And welcome back to Lawyer to Lawyer. I'm Craig Williams with Bob Ambrogi, and I today is Carl Williams, the staff attorney for the ACLU of Massachusetts, and Sandra Guerra Thompson, the director of the Criminal Justice Institute at the University of Houston Law Center. We've been discussing the drug lab scandal in Massachusetts that led to the dismissal of over 21,000 tainted drug cases. And Sandra, in the scheme of dismissals that are occurring, what happens in the situations where the dismissal essentially amounts to a technicality from the standpoint that the defendant actually was guilty?
Well, I mean, it should allow the person to have their record expunged, and if the jurisdiction also has some kind of law that provides for compensation for a person who's wrongly convicted, then they might be entitled to compensation as well, perhaps. But, otherwise, if you've already served the time, there's not much that can be done about that other than some kind of compensation.
Well, Carl, what about that? I mean, from what I've read, this dismissal of these 21,000 or more cases in some ways is just the start of another phase of this. It sounds like there's an issue about actually reaching all of the affected defendants. There are other cases that still remain to be possibly adjudicated in some way. So what happens from here going forward with these cases?
Well, I'll just say Massachusetts doesn't really have a process for expungement at all, unless you can actually prove that it was mistaken identity, like your twin brother did it or something. So there isn't a possibility for expungement for these folks unless the law changes. And as to, a little bit of a tough position in terms of talking about compensation for folks. I don't want to say, hey, yes, call me. But people can certainly seek counsel if they want to talk to a lawyer to take that up, or if they want to file something themselves. People can certainly try to look into that. I think there's a couple of hurdles to get over, but that's things people can look into. I will say some of these folks have been deported, right? Some people are, in Cape Verde or Dominican Republic or Haiti, because these convictions led to their deportation from the United States. And the idea that, the egg is cracked, putting it back together doesn't exactly work for some of these folks. And then there are also lower levels of, community-based or collateral consequences that are affecting these people. People lost their licenses, people lost their jobs, people's families had to move out of public housing because of these charges. And it's not just, go back and reapply for the job, or go back and, for those years that you couldn't drive a car, go back and be able to, right? People had to dramatically change their lives because they were affected by these tainted convictions.
What's the process even for letting them all know? I mean, do they all know at this point, or have they all been reached, or is there an effort ongoing to contact them all?
No and yes. They haven't all. They all do not know. And if we think that some people out of state, some people out of the country, we're aware that some people have passed away. It seems to actually now to be the position of the district attorneys not to dismiss the cases of the people who are dead. So there will be mailings to folks to let them know. We're also talking about doing, we have actually put out a lot of stuff on social media to let people know about this. And there actually is a hotline that people can call at the Committee for Public Counsel Services. Has a number people can call into to find out if they are one of the people whose cases has been dismissed, or one of the people who the case is going to try to be reprosecuted. And people can contact the public defender. That's the Committee for Public Counsel Services here in Massachusetts, to find out. They have that database, and they can look up someone's name and say, yes, your case from 2006 was dismissed. Congratulations. And I think that's important, because if people are facing those consequences because they say, oh, I have this conviction from back in the day, I might not want to apply for that job, or I might not want to be able to try to get a barber's license because I have a felony conviction. Knowing that is very important information.
Sandra, as far as the notice issues are concerned, would it be appropriate for a civil class action for all of these 21,000 individuals and then the court to order some type of private investigator perhaps to be involved in order to be able to notify everybody? I mean, how do you remedy the notice situation? And as part of that question, we'd like to take this moment to wrap up and get your final thoughts as well as your contact information so our listeners can reach out to you. Thank you.
Sure. Well, with regard to getting notice out, it's a real challenge, and we really haven't developed good procedures for doing that. I think in Texas, we see district attorneys sending out thousands of letters letting people know that cases have been affected and that they should, and actually telling them that they should call the public defender's office. But, this is a big challenge for a system as to whether they can file a lawsuit. That's really a matter that's better addressed by your other guests. But, I'm happy to talk to people if they're interested in how we're handling this in Texas. And I can be reached at the University of Houston Law Center. My email address is sg as in girl Thompson, THOMPSON @central.uh.edu.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We'll toss it over to you, Carl, as well to wrap up and get your final thoughts as well as your contact information.
I think the really key thing to look at here is that this is about essential parts of the criminal justice system and how we mete out justice in the United States. And at different points, we see pressure points and we see things sometimes pop. This is one of those or two of those places where the system popped. And I think we need to be on the lookout for these. I think we need to challenge what is happening in these, I don't want to say individual instances, but these mass instances, but also the way the system runs in general. Because injustices occur, they lead to, the mass incarceration system that we see in the United States where, we incarcerate more people per capita than anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the pieces. This is like on the factory line of that. So we at the ACLU of Massachusetts are committed to, when we see these types of injustices, when we see these challenges to due process, that we're going to fight like hell against them. And in that, people can get in touch with me. You can find us online at the ACLU Massachusetts.org. People can find me online on Twitter at Carlton Williams and cwilliams@aclum.org.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our show. I'm Craig Williams with my co-host Bob Ambrogi. Thank you for listening. Please join us next time for another great legal topic. When you want legal, think lawyer to lawyer.
Thanks for listening to Lawyer to Lawyer, produced by the broadcast professionals at Legal Talk Network. Join J. Craig Williams and Robert Ambrogi for their next podcast covering the latest legal topic. Subscribe to the RSS feed on LegalTalkNetwork.com or in iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.